Hi, I'm Sharon from Free Spirit Fabrics. We're here today to work with you on the Kaffetastic quilt along. We're working in two colorways. We're working with the Sunset colorway and the Bold colorway. We're going to show you some tips and tricks on different techniques that you can do for the two blocks that are in these quilts. There are only two. There is a 4-patch block and there is a square and square using half square triangles to create that block. I would recommend, as we're working through this process, that you label your fabrics. You can refer back to your fabric key in the instructions in the PDF, and you can see all of your fabrics laid out there. And it'd just be a helpful tip if you had that at the ready. And also, if you wanted to, you could label what each fabric was along, like this is, I don't know what fabric this is, but fabric O or fabric A or whatever the fabric is as you're working through the process. I'd like to come over to the machine. In terms of the sewing, this is set at a 2.5 for stitch length. There is typically no back stitching when you're quilting because the stitchers are so close. And if you have to reverse stitch, as I like to call it, which is a rip out, take your stitches out, it's difficult to do when the stitches are tight, but that also prevents having to do any back stitching as you begin and end in quilting. So as a tip for you, lower down, make your stitches tighter. I know that there are many new beginners that are starting on this project together, so we welcome you. We're glad that you're joining us, and we know that we have some very experienced quilters who are also joining this, and we're very excited to have you here as well. And we're hoping that everybody collaborates together with this quilt along and that you share your tips and tricks. I mean, I'm offering some here, and we'd like for you to also share your tips and tricks with us and with one another. The point of a quilt along is to do it. You could go to your quilt shop and do a quilt along. You could do it with your friends. You could do it on an evening. You could do it a Saturday or morning. Great time for you to get back together with quilters you haven't been quilting with recently, and you have a project here that you could get together and start working on to reconnect and get that camaraderie going, and hopefully you'll all find more tips and tricks as you go, and we would like you to share them with one another. That's the whole point of quilting, is to teach one another what we do and why we do it and how we love it and the fun of it, or the fun that it can be when we're not backstitching. So anyways, I'd like to get started. We're going to be working with the 4-patch. There's a couple of tips I'd like to show. One of them is nesting the 4-patch, and then we're going to do some chain stitching of this 4-patch as well. And then the half square triangle, I'm going to show you how to line this up and do some stitching, and how to use some tools to, when you were marrying the blocks together, how to get that thickness through the machine. So let's get started. Okay, so once you've cut out your fabric and you've cut these into the 3.5-inch segments, you're pressing the fabric into the dark. Whenever you're pressing, you want to press away from the lighter side of the fabric so that you won't see the seam. So then once you have them like this, you're going to want to put right sides together, and you can see how nicely the seam lies flat. So that's where you nest the seams. Now you can, if you'd like, sew them a different way. I don't recommend it. You can sew them like this, but you're going to have more bulk. I really recommend that you sew them like this, where they're flat, because you have to be thinking further down the line to when you're quilting and you're actually quilting the piece. If there's a lot of bulk in your piece, it's going to make it very difficult to get through all those layers once you start quilting. So I'm going to bring this over to the machine, and we're going to be sewing the 1/4-inch seam. And my pin is holding this in place. I just keep sewing through. Okay, so once you've sewn your 1/4-inch seam, and we're using yellow so that you can see it, you lay this down, and you can see how beautifully this is going to lay very nicely. Once it's pressed, it's going to lay very nicely flat, and the points meet perfectly in the middle. So this is the Oliso iron, which is very neat. You stop ironing and it goes up on its legs. There it is. That's very nicely done. I'd like to show you another technique on how to do this process. It's just slightly different. It's basically the same thing. We're taking the fabric, we're nesting these seams together. But the difference here is I'm going to stitch the seams together just in the middle to get them set. I'm going to throw, I don't know, like 6 or 7 stitches in there. And you can see the points are lined up very nicely. So this is all set. So now when you're sewing the rest of it, you don't have to worry about the center moving potentially while you're doing this. And just stitch your 1/4 inch seam right down. Just stitch, stitch, stitch. The center's already set. You don't need to worry that that might slip because it's already stitched. And you can see how nicely this came out as well. Beautifully, the center matches up, lies nice and flat. I'll bring over to my iron again. And there are your tips and tricks for doing the lining up the centers, nesting the four patch blocks. Now what I'd like to do is show you, if you're going to be making several of these, you can chain stitch them together. So this one, we have it nested. It's already prepared. I'm going to put the pin in just to hold it. I'm going to bring these over to the machine. I use my 1/4 inch foot. Get this lined up perfectly because I want to be as accurate as possible. So I'm going to stitch through this, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a second one and pull it up. I'm not going to cut the thread when I get to the end. That's called chain stitching. So when I get to the end, I'm going to bring up another one that needs to be stitched. I get my pin on it. And I'm just going to keep feeding it through the machine. I'm going to be doing my 1/4 inch. Okay. So when you're done, all of these are sewn together. So if you just chain stitch through, you're just doing the 1/4 inch seam, you're bringing the other one right up next to it. It's not together. You won't break threads as long as it's close. And then just keep stitching, stitching, stitching. And then you come in and you just cut this one, cut this one, cut this one. And now I've done 4 of them very quickly. And they're all ready to be pressed. And I've made a multitude of these, and there are many in both quilts. Okay, so there are many of these blocks in both of these quilts, and there were a total of 33 of these 4 square blocks that you're making for week 1. So once you have all of the 4 square blocks all cut apart, you can just lay them all out on your pressing board. You can press these all at the same time as well. Quick and easy. Get many done at the same time, which always speeds up the process and makes it so much nicer as it works along so quickly. And here you go. Got a multitude of the 4 patch blocks. So now we're going to work on the square and square block, and this uses the half square triangles. So you take your square that you have already cut, and we showed you in our last segment how to break these apart. going to cut these apart down the center. Have to be careful with these because this is cut on the bias. This cut right here is on the bias. And it stretches, which is nice in one respect but not good in another respect in terms of sewing. You want to make sure that it stays stable. So what I'm going to do is show you, you're going to take your half square triangle. Here's your block that you're sewing it to. I recommend you lay this out along a line if you'd like. I'm going to kind of eyeball it, and what you're going to do is lay the square on top. And these little corners on the ends are called dog ears. And I like to keep the dog ears on while I'm sewing. And I'll show you why as we go through the block. Now there's a couple of ways that you could do this. The way that I just did it, I'm eyeballing that this is 1/4 of an inch. Or you could in fact take your block, fold it in half, use a pencil and mark it. You could use a pin there to hold it. There's many different ways that you could do that. I'll do a pin to show you. I mean, if you wanted to use a pin, but again, you could mark it with a fabric pencil. Then you take one of these diamonds and fold them in half to find the center of both. And then you can line them up on top of each other. And then pin right there as soon as you have it lined up. And if you flip this over, I would recommend you pin on the ends. Hold everything steady. So like I said, you're working with a bias edge. And if you don't have this set and stabilized, this edge could be stretching while you're sewing, and you're going to get to the end and this is going to be way longer than it should be. And that will be frustrating because then your blocks will not be square as you move along in the process. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sew both of these half square triangles onto this block using my 1/4 inch seam. Try not to stitch over your pins. It's not a good thing. I know some people like to do it, but you're very likely going to ruin your machine doing so. So here's one. Here's the other. Okay, when you're done, you open it up, and there are the two sides. Now you can finger press this, or you could bring it to your iron and you could press it. But I'm just going to do a finger press for now. Now what you're going to do is take another one. Now these dog ears are extended. I'll show you why, because when you lay this down on top, you want to see that at this intersection right here, right in here, that should be about 1/4 of an inch. Not about, it should be 1/4 of an inch. I put a pin in here to hold it, because when I start to stitch, I'm going to start to stitch right there. And if you didn't have the dog ear there, you're not going to catch it. And then down here on the end, you got the same. I'm going to put the pin this way. Right in here, it's 1/4 of an inch. So as you're stitching, as you begin your stitching here and you come down, you're going to come right out at the 1/4 of an inch. So like I said, you want to keep these dog ears on because you can use them as a guide in this part of the process. I'm going to put a pin in the middle just to hold it. Okay, so now we have 3 sides on. It's looking good. Just going to finger press that. Now I'm going to put the last side on. You can work from either side of the piece. You can work from the back or you can work from the front, whichever you feel most comfortable with. You'll find different ways that you can do it that are more comfortable to you as you're working on it. Do what you feel most comfortable with, because that's going to make the whole process go much smoother for you. You don't want to be frustrated with what you're trying to do. Okay, so I have this one all pinned. I just want to show you before we stitch. This is a 1/4 inch in, and you start here. You're coming down this edge, 1/4 inch, and when you come out on this side, it's 1/4 inch. So now you've got the 4 dog ears here, and it's important, like I said, that they remain. Excuse me, that they remain, because you're going to be able to catch this as you're sewing. If you've cut them off prior to doing that, you're going to lose that as a guide. Okay, so now the block is all sewn together. I'm going to bring it over here to iron. I'm pushing all of the seams towards the black. They kind of naturally fall that way, but in this block, I like to press from the top so I can see to make sure I've pushed out excuse me, all the seams. Now if you look at the back, you can see the yellow stitching. 1/4 inch seams, and you can see where we came up and went out. So now we're all set with this block, and we can sew it to the 4 patch. Okay, so now what we have is we have our square and square, which came up very nice. It's beautifully flat, and we have our 4 patch block, and we're going to sew these together. So again, right sides together. I'm going to line them up. And I do recommend that you work from this side. So right here at this intersection here, right there at that point, I like to put my pin, and I like to find the seam on the 4 patch block right here. And I like to put my pin through right here, because then I know I've lined up this part of the sewing so that my points will meet. Then I'm going to come down, just going to pin this corner and pin this corner. The technique that I'd like to show you with this, along with that pin as a guide here when you're lining that up, is this is very bulky as you're sewing, because you've got the seam on this side, and then you've got a double seam here on the top of your square and square block. So I'm going to show you when I'm sewing that we're going to come down this edge, and I'm going to use this awl to help hold this fabric in place on the machine. You don't have to press really, really hard. You just have to hold it so that it can go through the needle, because sometimes it will become distorted as you come sewing through this area. So I want to show you how it can be done smoothly. So we're doing the 1/4 inch seam. Take my pins out. Okay, so now I'm approaching that bulky area. So now I'm going to take the awl, I'm going to kind of stick it in here under the foot a little bit, and kind of guide the fabric through. I'm pulling out my pin before I get there. Got the awl, and it's helping to push the fabric along. And I pull out my last pin, and I finished this seam. Now, if you don't have an awl, that looks really nice. So the points came together here. So we've got this and we've got that point. I'd like to show you that if you don't have an awl, you can use a T-pin. That's what I was using before I got the awl. So you can use the T-pin as it's going through, because it's a nice sturdy pin. You know, this is much more sturdy, but if you don't have one, you could certainly use a stronger pin. You could potentially even use one of these pins, but they're just not quite as strong. I just think that this would be a nicer option to try to do that. And that's how you sew your four block square together with your square and square. And it's just a technique to show you how to lower the probability of it getting all distorted as you're sewing through there. And now we will move on. So we finished sewing together the 4-patch and the square and square blocks together, and I'm hoping that these tips and tricks have been helpful to you today. If they have been, please leave us a note or comment on our Facebook page, or if you have any additional tips or tricks to offer, we would love to have you leave those tips there. We are very excited about this, and we're happy to move on to week 2.